Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I see some familiar faces, so I appreciate you coming out. And to those who already know me and get to hear me talk all the time. So just a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Deborah Jacobson. I'm a special education attorney, so all I do is represent parents against school districts. And all of my cases involve getting kids services. I don't only do mental health, but it has turned out to be a little bit of a specialty of mine because I do so many of these cases. I've been practicing in the Bay Area. I went to law school in the Bay Area. I graduated in 2011, and I've only done this work. I got hired by a special education law firm in Washington, D.C. That does special education, and I represented kids there through the court system. They actually do court-appointed special education attorneys there, which is very different than how they do it here. So anyway, after DC, I moved back here and started my own practice, and been doing it in Berkeley for 3.5 years now. And I do represent families all over the Bay Area, but tend to stick closer to the East Bay. So I'm going to start off with just a little history about educationally related mental health services. It has not always been the case that the school districts are responsible to pay for mental health services. It used to be that the county mental health paid for it. That was Assembly Bill 114 changed that process and made it to where the school districts are now responsible. This process in California has made it a little disjointed because the IEP process can sometimes be separated from the mental health process, which can make it confusing. So previously with county mental health, what would happen is that the school districts would refer a mental health case out to the county. And, sorry, I'm a little bit nervous right now for some reason. I've done so many presentations. I don't know if I drank too much coffee or what, but I'm a little bit nervous right now.
You're doing great.
I'm just going to take a deep breath for a minute. And seriously, I do a lot of presentations. I don't know why I'm nervous.
Can I just ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Around when did this change take place from county to the school district?
I believe, and I'm sorry, I didn't put it in the slide, but it was under Schwarzenegger.
Oh, so there's a while ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago. And under that process, it was a lot easier to get mental health services because it went to the county, and the county has more funding, obviously, than the school districts. But under that administration, or under Schwarzenegger, they wanted to cut that funding down and put it on the school districts, which is not ideal, obviously. So it used to be a lot easier during that time, but it was under Schwarzenegger. So when it switched over, it went to school districts, and I have to say it still is very confusing. In DC, it's always been the responsibility of the school districts. So for me, I was very used to going into the IEP process and that mental health aspect of it being a part of the IEP process. Now I hear a lot of families say to me, well, you know, my child was assessed and the school district knew it was about mental health, but they said that they had to refer it out to the ERMS team. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So the ERMS team the ERMS educationally related mental health team sometimes is disjointed and can be separate from the IEP team. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So when AB 114 passed, it became the responsibility of school districts, and school districts only. That went away from county mental health. So no longer do school districts say, oh, this kid has, you know, severe mental health problems. Let's shift it over to county mental health, who specializes in this and who knows all the placements and knows all the therapists and knows all the services that can be provided. Now all of a sudden it became the responsibility of the school districts, which was not an easy transition, and it still is not easy for the school districts. A lot of them still don't have experts in the area. So there's three kind of possibilities, and it really depends on the school district where you're in. as to how they handle mental health. So one of those is that the school districts hire mental health professionals. And that's the ideal situation, that you are dealing with a school district that has somebody within their team that understands mental health and knows placements, and it's more of a seamless process. Another kind of option, which I see in places such as Berkeley and Alameda, is that they contract with community mental health agencies. So this means that after AB 114 passed, the mental health, or the school district said, you know what, you guys are doing so good with this, we're just going to contract with you. And unfortunately, you don't have to pay for it anymore, but we'll pay you to continue doing it. And that's when it can get pretty disjointed. The third one is just private agencies that they contract with. Some of you might be familiar with an agency called COFFEE, Community Options for Family and Youth. They're a private agency that school districts contract with to go do assessments and make recommendations. So I'm going to talk about, and just to be clear, I want to say that this presentation is really just focusing on residential. So if you have questions that kind of take a step back from residential and other mental health placements and services, please feel free to kind of step in and ask that. But I am focusing on residential because it's a big umbrella of services and placements that can be offered. So the first thing that I want to talk about is that there's two different types of placements, and this is kind of the beginning of when parents start to say to me, I want a residential placement or I think my child needs a residential placement, I should say, not want, it's usually me. Or, you know, a slew of experts have said that my child needs residential. There's two paths that parents can go, or that parents end up going down. And I'll get into these more detail, but just as an overview. The first one is IEP placement. And this is ideal for a number of reasons that I will discuss, but mostly because it takes away all funding responsibility off the parents. And IEP placement is basically an admission by the school district that your child cannot learn in any other environment other than residential placement. And they contract with the residential school and they keep them there until necessary. And this is a longer process. So usually the parents that have the kind of flexibility to go through this IEP process have been in it for a long time. They've gone through a bunch of different steps, and residential is kind of the last option. Alternatively, unilateral placement tends to be when parents and families are in crisis. And they don't have time to go through this long process of IEP placement, and they decide, that they have to do this immediately. Often a matter of life and death, often a matter of crisis. They don't have time for the IEP process to take its place, and usually at that point, if a child is in crisis and hasn't gotten any services from the school district previously, oftentimes it can be, the school district might be responsible or might have failed that child in some way. And so in those cases, we would be looking for reimbursement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the IEP process. These are just, I'll go through each one of these bullet points. There's identification and the referral for assessment, the actual assessment process, eligibility for special education, and a lot. FAPE is free appropriate public education. And I didn't put a whole lot of law into this presentation. When I say I didn't put a whole lot of law into it, I didn't quote a bunch of law because it's readily available on the internet, and I didn't want to kind of bog this down with reading statutes for you. But if you do have specific questions about what exactly the law says, please raise your hand and feel free to ask. But that the term FAPE is a big one. It's free appropriate public education, and it's what all children with disabilities are entitled to. Emphasis on the free. Where it becomes difficult, and my battle is usually in the appropriate part. So we'll start off with identification. And a legal term of art called child find. So child find is where this process starts. And it is a school district's affirmative obligation to identify, locate, and evaluate children with disabilities residing within the school district, within its boundaries. This is probably one of the cases that I win most, one of the issues that I win most, because it's so broad. So this is the obligation of the school district to actually go out and find children with disabilities. And there's something called notice. The second that a school district, and when I say school district, I'm talking about any of the employees that work for the school district. I'm talking about teachers, I'm talking about counselors, I'm talking about instructional aides. Anybody who has a contract with the school district is considered the district. So when I use that term, that is what I'm talking about. So when anybody from the district has reason to suspect that a child might have a disability, they have a legal obligation to refer that child for special education. So what does that look like? When does a teacher, therapist, counselor have reason to suspect? The bar is very low. The courts have determined that the bar is very low. So for example, a child, is spending 50% of his time in a, outside room with a counselor because he's getting overwhelmed in the class, he's getting depressed, he has anxiety. A teacher is emailing the parent saying, your child is getting pretty overwhelmed in here. When a child doesn't come to school for 3 weeks and the child has had, in the past, very good attendance. When a child complains to a teacher that he's depressed, when a teacher or somebody at the school district has knowledge that a child has been 5150. These are all examples of notice. Automatically, that puts a trigger in, it triggers the obligation of that person that has that notice to assess the child for special education. And it doesn't mean that the person has to know that the child has a disability. It means that they have to suspect that they might. So it's a low legal bar. And it's one, like I said, that when a child find issue is involved, it's usually one of my stronger issues because of that low legal bar. And also, it sets out the chain of events. If a child is not referred for assessment, they can't get an IEP, they can't get services, they never go into that system. So if when child find is violated, it might give parents an excuse to go and make that referral themselves, and they have to do their own thing. They don't have the ability to work with a team. They have to make their own decisions.
So you're basically saying that, say a child has a substantial amount of mental illness, and the school district the child hasn't been identified, then the parents maybe decide to put him in a private school because he's not functioning. Are you saying that the parents have an argument against the school district that the child was originally in for failing to identify this child? Okay, and that gives you already right away sort of a strike against them and an edge.
Yes.
But it's not going to pay for services, but it gets you a leg up from the beginning.
It depends.
Okay.
Yeah, it definitely depends. I had a case where a kid, like I said, he was spending the majority of his time in a school counselor's room hiding under a table because he thought a plane was going to crash into the school.
Okay.
Yeah. That was a really intense, and this went on for a year. The school itself, 5150 the kid 4 times, never referred him for special education. So in that case, the parents unilaterally placed, and of course, they were held responsible for all of those unilateral placements.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering along those lines, as long as, if it's a mental health issue, if the child is not experiencing academic failure,
Yeah, we'll
does
get
the
into
school have
that.
an obligation?
We'll get into that. We'll get into the defenses that school districts have and whether or not they're valid. If you don't mind, I'll circle back around to that question.
Would a 5150 be a presumption that there is a need for referral?
My argument is always yes. I will say that school districts often argue no. For me, if a 5150, that's an automatic presumption that, and I argue this regularly, that somebody should have suspected that there was something going on with this kid. I will say that there are external factors, and we'll get into that too with defenses as to why a child might be 5150. That might not have to do with long-standing mental health issues. That might have to do with an external, something that happened to them that night or something that, so there are exceptions to that. But generally speaking, I say yes, there is a presumption.
Is there a statute of limitations on that?
Yep, we'll get to that too.
And just in terms of assessment, so if the patient has had an assessment for educational ADHD, that kind of thing, and has services for that, is an additional separate assessment needed for them to be?
We'll talk about that
mental
too.
health?
Yeah. So I do have quite a bit of slides on, so if we want to hold questions or just ask directly related, because I will get to all of those ones. Yeah.
What's a 5150?
Good question. A 5150 is a psych hold, danger to self or others. So it's when a child is in danger or putting somebody else in danger, they can be held.
Involuntary.
Exactly.
And just really quickly, would a 5150, should it trigger an IEP on the part of the school?
That's what I was saying. I think that for me, as an attorney, I argue under most circumstances that it should trigger at minimum a referral for assessment. Okay.
That's what you meant by referral.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of ways that a child can be, or a lot of different avenues for referral. Parent referral, and I think this is something that Patty is very good about instructing families, I know. With a parent referral, it needs to be in writing. It doesn't have to be, but in terms of proof, in terms of a legal case, it needs to be in writing. When a parent refers a child for special education in writing, a school district has to do it. There are some exceptions to that. They can provide what's called prior written notice and say, we have no reason to assess and we are ready to defend that assertion. But I will say that they do have to defend that in the Office of Administrative Hearings if they decide that they don't want to assess. But parents need to, I always say put it in writing, a letter requesting assessment. It can be very simple, an email. My child is suffering from X, X, and X. This is affecting his or her ability to learn in the general education environment, and I'm requesting a special education assessment. Proof of service is really nice in terms of, a legal case for me. I know it's not always possible for parents. Emails tend to be okay these days. They tend to hold up in the administrative body that hears these cases. But ideally, you're going to drop this off, you're getting a received stamp, you're sending it certified mail, or you're faxing it, just so that there's proof. I sent this letter requesting assessment, and that triggers a process and a timeline as well, which I'll get into in a minute. School district referral. So anybody from the school district can make a referral. And I will tell you, and I think I'll start off by saying this because I'll get into it more, there's a lot of politics involved. Understatement of the year, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that has nothing to do with you or your child. And it starts with the referral. I can tell you that a lot of teachers, counselors get told, don't make these referrals. Each assessment, school psychologists are stressed, have way too many cases. An assessment will mean the parents understanding that there might be services involved in that. These kind of reasons for kids not getting services start early. I know a lot of people that work in schools, and actually my legal assistant used to be a special ed teacher, and she told me that she would get scolded and in trouble if she was referring kids to special education. And I do want to remind you that it goes back to child find. Most of these teachers and people are not aware of child find. And it ends up hurting the school district. I've had multiple teachers as clients, residential placements teachers that have had, that I'm going up against the school district they work for. And they didn't hear the word child find until I told them what it was and told them, you're gonna win your case because of this child find issue. So it's not necessarily, I would say almost never is it a personal, we don't want to give this child services or we're against this child. It's, it's a whole scheme of roadblocks that the teachers face as well as parents and students. So those school district referrals do often come though from counselors, special ed teachers, principals, and third-party referral. And I want to say this is a big trigger for child find. A lot of times, kids are in outside therapy. They have therapists, they're working with psychiatrists that are familiar with the system, and they'll say, here, give this letter to your school district, or give this letter to somebody, the principal. And it will say, I've been treating so-and-so, and this child should be eligible for special education because of X, Y, and Z. That is considered a referral. The second that letter goes to a school district, that triggers child find. That means that the assessment process should begin. So it doesn't have to come from you. There also is a law, I should say, that if you do not understand how to put a request in writing, if you go and ask a teacher, I've heard this thing called special education, there is a statute that says that they have an obligation to help you put that request in writing, to help you start that process. That's another thing, when parents go to counselors and say, I've heard that school districts might have this, might be able to help you. And they say, well, no, or, don't help the parent through that process. That's another violation. And those are things that I'm always looking for when I'm looking at cases. So once that referral is made, school districts give you an assessment plan, also referred to as AP. They'll say, here's an AP for you. An assessment plan is basically a request for consent to start the assessment process. School districts can't just assess your children. They have to have consent of the parents. So what this looks like is a sheet of paper that has all these areas checked. We're going to assess your child in the area of intellectual ability, in the area of academics, in the area of social emotional. And it just looks like a checklist. And they hand it to you and say, will you please sign this? And basically what it is consent. They don't always do it in all areas necessary. And that's a whole other issue of that we're not necessarily going to get into in this talk. But at minimum, if the child is experiencing symptoms that may require mental health service, not an issue of the IEP team referring it out for mental health. It should all be an integral part.
So if my daughter already has an IEP, but there was not a mental health assessment, and I request a mental health assessment, do they still have 60 days to accomplish that?
So it depends on the case, and it depends on whether if they had knowledge of mental health issues when she was first assessed. If they did have knowledge of mental health issues, then they should have assessed that right at the beginning. If they didn't, then yes, and you're just now putting them on notice, then yes, they would have to give you an additional assessment plan and they would have an additional 60 days to do it. So it all depends on what they have notice of.
So does autistic spectrum count as mental health?
That's a good question. So it depends on the
Autistic
child,
like.
right? Yeah, so it depends on the child. I mean, I have a lot of kids that are on the spectrum that have resulting mental health issues because of,
They mostly have anxiety.
Yeah, anxiety and because of bullying. So they suffer from depression, social anxiety. I mean, I have a lot of kids that end up, in these situations of extreme despair,
Right.
and suicide attempts are on the spectrum. Okay. So they're not mutually exclusive. I have a lot of kids on the spectrum that don't have mental health issues, right? So that's not an automatic. You have to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
And ADHD is considered an educational and not a mental health, correct?
I'll get into that too when we talk about diagnosis. Yes.
You're giving these timelines. If the school district does not follow the timelines, what is the recourse?
Good question. So with this one, it depends on how long they go over the timeline. So there's what's called procedural violations and substantive violations. So procedural means they violated a procedure. And then we have to look at whether or not that caused harm to the child. So if it's 5 days over, could you get you could probably file a complaint about that, but what are you asking for? What's the remedy for 5 days? If it's 2 months, and we're talking about a child in crisis, there can be serious consequences to that. So if, they have this 60-day timeline and 80 days have gone by and the child is in crisis, the parents tried to wait and they had to unilaterally place their kid because of the school district failing to meet those timelines, then you have a different remedy there, more leverage. Does that answer your question?
Then, is it 60 school days? Like what happens if summer vacation intervenes?
60 school days.
It's 60
Oh,
school
that's
days.
it. So you're on your own in the summer.
Yeah.
That was my question.
Weekdays or?
Yes. Yes, school days.
So then that's actually longer than 60 days.
It is actually longer than
A
60
lot
days.
longer.
And if the summer intervenes, forget it.
Well, I mean, even
Which
in the
is why-
standard school year,
yeah.
5 school days, so it's a week, so.
And this
Instead of
is
2 months
why,
you're talking there, you're talking almost 3 months.
yeah. And this is why we have so many unilateral placements for mental health, right? Because when we're talking about emergencies and crisis, a lot of parents can't wait through this process.
Yeah, 60 business days is what you're saying, really.
Let
This is all
me,
this, 60 business days, correct?
let me clarify, the weekends count, holidays do not. So it's school days, and holiday is considered a summer break. But nonetheless, that's a long time. 2 months is a long time to wait, even if there's no holidays, when you're trying to get your kid help. So, I'm gonna go back to this now, the duty to comprehensively assess in all areas of suspected disability. So this goes back to the question of, if they're autistic, do they have to do a mental health assessment? They do if the child is displaying mental health issues. Again, I have a lot of kids with autism. I have one kid right now that, hasn't left his house in a year and a half. He's autistic. So there's that, but there's also a lot of other stuff going on with him. It's very rarely a straightforward case when we're talking about kids with disabilities. Almost never is there a kid with just autism or just mental health issues or just ADHD. It's usually very complex, just like neurology is very complex, right? These are all neurological disorders, and they get intertwined and hard to suss out. But it is the school district's duty and obligation, legal obligation, to look at all of those different areas. So psychoeducational assessment v. ERMS. Again, this is just going back to that initial issue that I said with AB 3632, how it used to be with mental health. So mental health used to be educationally related mental health services were a different branch. School district was a different branch. School district then, they used to be all about referrals, right? This kid has mental health issues, get him out, go to county. Because then the county is paying for it. But now, the school districts still have not really taken in all of that responsibility. They weed it out and they'll say, oh, well, we did the psychoeducational assessment at the IEP meeting, and you're like, okay, am I gonna get my placement option here or my offer? And they say, oh, it looks like we need to do a mental health assessment here. And all of a sudden you're waiting for 60 more days, right? So I always tell parents, when you have mental health issues, that needs to happen at the beginning of the process. It's not, no, let's wait and see and do more and more assessments. And this is a tactic of school districts, I will tell you, to draw out the process. Joanne?
Hi. I don't want to keep you interrupted, and maybe you want to just get through this. But one of the things is mental health, by the district's view of it, is they often see your kid as perfectly fine, kind of normal. And what you see, or what you believe, different.
Yeah. This is where the battle comes in, right? As to whether it's clinical, whether it's, especially when we're talking about, and I'll get into this again with the defenses, but whether there's clinical issues here or whether this is a child with, developmental, high school, adolescence, there's a lot of different reasons that kids struggle. And again, this goes back to that whole political funding money gatekeeper issue of the school district is always going to find a way to place that blame on something other than a disability because they are responsible for disabilities and nothing else. So we'll get into that when we talk more about defenses. Yeah.
So what should you ask your school district specifically if you're getting a psychoeducational assessment? Should you ask for a mental health?
Yes.
What do you ask for?
So that's a really good question. So when you ask for assessment, and what I always say is make sure that mental health is included. Because some districts do. Some districts have really integrated this process and they have, a clinical psychologist with a background in mental health doing the psychoeducational assessment. And EARMS is just part of that. An example of one of those school districts is Albany Unified. They have mental health people on the staff. Berkeley Unified, they still contract with county mental health. So they do these, psychoeducational assessments, which consists of intellectual testing, academic testing, some tools that they use that look kind of on the surface of social emotional functioning. But then they say, oh, there's serious mental health issues here. We're going to refer this out to county mental health for them to do an assessment, or one of these other agencies. The same with Alameda Unified, they refer it out. Oakland depends on who you have and what school district or what school site you're at. So it's all very different. So my advice is to always just put in writing, my child has mental health issues, I want them assessed for that now. Not at the end of the psychoeducational assessment process.
And so that's done by usually a licensed educational person, the psycho ed one.
Psychoeducational assessment is usually done by a school psychologist.
Right.
It's questionable, and that is a legal issue
Okay.
as to who is qualified to do the mental health assessment. Most of the administrative hearing decisions have found that school psychologists are qualified to make mental health recommendations. I might fight that depending on what their recommendations are or background is.
Biased.
So say you have a kid who's 20, right?
Uh-huh.
And they start failing. Can you request your district do an assessment? Doesn't the school district have you till 21?
The school district has, it's a good question, and that's an interesting issue that you bring up. So children are entitled to services until A, they graduate from high school, or B,
Okay.
they turn 22.
Oh, okay.
But usually, if a child is 20, they're not going to still be in the system if they don't already have an IEP.
Okay.
So theoretically, you could go after them for having never done anything. There's a 2-year statute of limitations, which we'll talk about.
Okay.
Okay.
We just kind of went through this part of this process right here, and we actually got the information yesterday from the school psychologist. But I don't think he did a mental health assessment, like you were just saying. We're talking about that. Well, we gave him a diagnosis.
I'll get into that.
So if we give him a diagnosis and they accept that and they put it in the report, are they accepting that he does have this?
So this is, that's actually the next dot here, is provision and consideration of private assessments. Again, it really depends on the school district, and it really depends on the qualifications and kind of critical thinking skills, general decency of the school psychologist. So I have some school districts that say, we don't look at medical diagnosis, that's not educational. We're looking only at educational criteria. So there's a very big difference, and this is somewhere where parents, it's not easy to suss out, and it's something that's important to know. There's a very big difference between a medical diagnosis and meeting the educational criteria of a disability. Not all children meet educational criteria of a disability that have a diagnosis. Not all children that meet educational criteria have a diagnosis. A good example of that is autism. I have a number of kids that are receiving services under the disability classification and the education code under autism, but they don't have a diagnosis of autism. They can, school districts are required to consider outside assessments, consider outside diagnosis. I mean, when I have a kid that gets a neuropsychological assessment, a private one done, and has, a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, ODD, ADHD, mood disorder, NOS, a million different diagnoses, diagnoses, that can't be ignored. We can't just, and I argue that all of that has to be considered. But it's, it becomes one of these things where parents say, well, my child was diagnosed with ADHD, therefore they should have an IEP. And not all kids with ADHD qualify for IEPs. It has to affect their ability to gain educational benefit, and they have to be able to, they can't do it without accommodations that are available to everybody.
So then what you're saying, from what I'm hearing, is that you have to have the school district actually do their own mental health assessment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And I have to say, when I worked in DC, the courts did their own, they would refer these kids out automatically to a clinic, and the kids would get the assessment. We'd hand that assessment over to the school district, they would review it and decide whether or not a kid gets an IEP. And that seems really logical to me. But here in California, they want to do their own assessment because they want to be able to fight you if they don't agree with legal obligation to consider outside assessments. So if you have an outside assessment done previously, when you hand in that request for assessment, you give them all of that information. You can't later go back to the school district and say, well, we had this diagnosis and we had this other assessment done, and they say, well, I never saw that. Also, another thing to consider when we're talking about outside assessments is that there's certain assessment tools that can only be used once in a year, or else it's considered invalid. So I have a lot of families that have just gotten their kids comprehensively assessed by a private neuropsychologist, and then they go to the school district and say, we want our kid assessed, and the school psychologist uses the same tools. For example, they use the WISC, which is intellectual testing that has already been used 3 months prior, and all of a sudden that testing is invalid. And you don't have an argument because you didn't give them the assessment, they didn't know. So then your kid's going through another 60 days, right, of more assessments because they have to go back and do a different tool that's not going to be invalid, and it just draws out that process.
So if they take the diagnosis into consideration and they include it in the IEP, then that suffices as the mental health assessment, or there should also be a mental health assessment?
It depends, and like I said, it depends on the school district. So what I would do is I would ask them, did you do a mental health assessment? Is ERMS included in this? Is educationally related mental health services included in this assessment? They might say yes, absolutely, we do that as part of our comprehensive assessment, which is what they should be doing. Or they might say, no, we're going to wait until the IEP meeting and the team will determine whether or not this needs to be referred to ERMS. And then you have another 60 days to sit and wait. So I would ask right away, if you can, did you include an ERMS assessment in this process? So like I said, the consideration and provision of private assessments is important. It's the #1 thing that, when I get involved in a case and they say, oh, we have these private assessments, did you give that to the school district? Because these are excuses, these are ways that they get out of their responsibilities. Well, we didn't know, we didn't have that assessment, we didn't, and it's true, and all of this stuff is hard to just hand over willy-nilly to school districts, right? Because it's personal, and like I said, most families are in crisis. And it's private, and it's embarrassing, and it's, scary. So I understand why families aren't just throwing all of these confidential medical documents at school districts. But for funding and for a legal case, full disclosure is necessary, completely necessary.
I'm sorry, I apologize. But we did inform them from the very beginning of the diagnosis and everything else. So now does it become their responsibility to request this information from us? Or is it still our responsibility, even though we notified them of this, to give it to them?
I mean, it could go either way.
Okay, fair enough.
If I had a school psychologist on a witness stand, were you aware that this child had a diagnosis of, bipolar disorder? Well, yes, I was. Well, did you ask the parents where and when they got that diagnosis? Did you ask for this documentation that proved that? I mean, it could theoretically be on them, but it also doesn't look great on the parent side if they say, my kid has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder and doesn't hand over the documentation for that.
Okay.
So I always say err on the side of caution, give them everything. Don't give the school district any excuses to say that you didn't give us something.
Okay, so the onus is on us, is what you're saying. Okay, that's all.
Excuse me. Folks, I would just like to say,
that we have a very limited time with our speakers today. And I want to make sure, we want to make sure we get all the information they have to share. So if you could write your questions down, hold them until the end. We will have 15 or 20 minutes with each speaker to be able to ask questions and a little time afterwards.
Jan, what is our time check here? How much time do I have?
Figured to start the questions about 11:15.
Okay, great. So I just want to say quickly, and this is something that you might want to look up because this is a big one, IEEs. If you do not agree with the school district's findings, you have the right to request an independent assessment. As an attorney, when I do a case, I always, not always, I would say almost always, 90% of the time, tell parents I have to have an expert. An IEE, an independent assessment, is my expert. Whoever did their assessment is their expert. If we're going to fight against what the school district says, unfortunately, parents are not credible in the eyes of the law. Even though, as a parent, I know that you all know your child better than any other person that could possibly tell you anything. Unfortunately, judges don't care that you think your kid needs residential treatment. They need to hear that from an expert that says there's no other option. So I always say, so school districts have, when you ask for an independent assessment based on the fact that you don't agree with their assessment, they have two options. They can file for due process, which is kind of like a lawsuit. They're filing with the Office of Administrative Hearings saying, these parents don't have a right to an independent assessment and we are going to defend our assessment. That's option number one. Option number two is to fund that assessment. I always say there's no harm in asking and trying to get that paid for by the school district, because if they file against you and you don't want to deal with it, all you have to do is say, never mind, I don't want it. So I always say, no matter what, get that independent assessment. If there's anything, if the assessment that the school psychologist did is not comprehensive in some way, if they reach some weird conclusions, if they said, oh, you know, this child clearly has a lot of mental health issues, but he used to get good grades, so it doesn't matter, which I'll get into that as a defense. You need to get an expert. You need to get somebody on your side that says, no, this is what is necessary. This is where this child needed to be, and there was no other option at the time, and somebody that's qualified to do that. So I'm just going to talk about this quickly because I think we already addressed it in the sense of, you know, diagnosis versus eligibility criteria. But usually when I'm looking at mental health, when I'm looking at kids that are going to RTCs that qualify to go to residential treatment or need residential treatment, they qualify under one of two categories usually. And it's otherwise health impairment and or emotional disturbance. Otherwise health impairment is due to chronic or acute health problems such as asthma, attention deficit disorder, attention deficit. So it's a health condition is the first criteria that adversely affects a child's educational performance. And it has to be chronic. So often this is ADHD. I've argued that a child who didn't meet the criteria for ED, which I'll get into next, met the criteria for OHI because of severe anxiety. That is a health condition that is often chronic and that often really affects a child's ability to gain educational benefit. So again, I have kids with severe anxiety disorders, agoraphobia that doesn't leave the house. They wouldn't necessarily qualify under emotional disturbance, although they usually do. But they qualify under OHI. I do want to throw in really quick here for any parents that have children of African American descent. There is an over-identification that is kind of overcompensated for now of Black children with the criteria of emotional disturbance. So school districts are very careful, which they should be, about over-identifying Black kids under the category of ED, which is severe emotional disturbance. So they might say, you know, so kids might qualify under OHI. They might say, you know, try to wiggle that around to OHI instead of ED so they don't get pinged for over-identification. What I want to say, and kind of the most important part of this part of the conversation, is that it doesn't matter. Legally, it does not matter where your child falls, what criteria they fall into. I have parents that call me that school districts are ready and willing to give whatever, And they want to have a battle over whether or not their child qualifies under emotional disturbance or otherwise health impaired, because, you know, they've heard from somewhere that, you know, this label of emotional disturbance is going to stick with them forever. Is that true? Possibly. But the law doesn't care. The law says once a child qualifies for special education under any disability classification, then the school district's only responsibility is to make an IEP that meets that child's specific needs. So this is a label, it's a category. I don't and I won't fight over it, you know, it's, parents want to often, but the thing that you need to be aware of is that if your child qualifies, they have to make a document that they have to make a plan that meets your kid's needs, no matter what they think the disability classification is. If you get that door opened up to you, if your child meets eligibility under either OHI or ED, take it and go with it. You have an IEP now. You know, there's no point in fighting over the disability classification, is my opinion. ED, I would say 95% of the kids that end up in residential treatment meet this disability classification. So as you can see, a child just has to exhibit one or more of these characteristics over a long period of time and to a marked degree. I want to address A, because school psychologists always get this one wrong. An inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. So this just means that the kid can't learn even though they're really smart, even though they have the ability to learn. So oftentimes they look over this one, and this one is big. You know, this one applies to the kids that can't go to school because they're anxiety ridden. And they'll say, the school psychologists always say, well, they can learn. You know, there's no impairment here, they can learn. And so that one is big, so I always say, well, they can't learn if they're not in school. So it's important to look at that. A lot of these kids that end up in residential treatment, not all of them, but have average to high average intellectual functioning. You know, it's those really, really, really smart kids often that have a lot of anxiety. So it's big to know, and we'll talk more about that. Of course, there's other circumstances. Also, inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances. This one is a heavy hitter. I can get a lot of kids that qualify under this one. Kids that, you know, are slitting their wrists because somebody called them fat. So, you know, I mean, this is a big one where kids have, you know, they're acting in a way that is not typical of a child with typical coping skills or abilities or stable mental health, well adjusted. So that's a big one. And I'm going to get down into this now. We'll get into the defenses part, which I think all of you really want to talk about. ED includes schizophrenia, but does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted. And I'm going to take a nice little chunk of time to talk about social maladjustment and what that means, and what that means in terms of cases that I will take and won't take, and what that means in terms of when a school district is responsible and when they're not responsible. And we'll start off with the social maladjustment versus mentally ill. So this is, again, one of these things, and I will go off on my little kind of moral ethical tangent here that says that, you know, we are all taxpayers. Residential treatment is very, very expensive. And there are parents who, you know, want residential treatment for their kids who have never had mental health issues but are starting to have behavioral issues that are kind of typical of teens. So for example, a kid that's never had a mental health problem but is, you know, got caught stealing, or, you know, is hanging out with the wrong group of kids. I think as a parent, I know that every parent is justified in the decisions that they make, but there is a very big difference between mental health issues and kind of what the school districts call social maladjustment. There's no legal definition for. There has to be at least some record of diagnosis, long-standing history. I would say I've only had probably 4 or 5 families out of dozens and dozens that have called me where I've said, this is not a case of mental illness, or this is not a case of disability. You know, usually if kids are acting to a point where parents are even considering residential, there's usually a history there of ADHD, behavioral issues, some sort of issues there that have been long-standing. So I don't want to minimize that, but I do want to say that This is where that defensiveness comes from the schools, because there are some parents that try to get, that want boarding school, that want, residential treatment for kids that don't have mental health issues. So it's important to distinguish, it's important to, for me as a professional, to really consider which cases I'm going to take and when cases really require that residential treatment. So I covered that, the social maladjustment, bad kid, your kid just acts this way because they're bad, not because they have some, issue that, ADHD, severe ADHD makes kids impulsive. There's a very big difference between a kid without ADHD who smacks a kid and a kid that does have ADHD who smacks another kid. Impulsivity is a big one. So the other defense, and this is the one I know Patty and everybody has said they really want me to zone in on this. Your child is smart and can get good grades. I see that so often. They don't want to assess and they don't, won't find them eligible because they're smart and they've gotten good grades in the past. One of the most severe cases I've ever had was with a girl who got straight A's her entire academic career until she turned 17 and had a complete mental breakdown. Straight A student, head of every club, team, you could ever think of. And she had a complete mental breakdown when she turned 17, and that was the school district's defense. She doesn't need special education. She's smart. She gets good grades. That's not an excuse. A lot of really, really smart kids have special education needs. A lot of really, really smart kids have disabilities. So, if they say your kid gets good grades, it doesn't matter, especially during that initial assessment. They'll say, we're not going to assess. We looked at the records, and I know many districts that are notorious for this. We looked at your child's records, and they have the ability to get good grades. They're smart. Yeah.
I guess just along those lines, my question is not just if they have the ability because they have in the past, as long as they currently are, is that, do they have to get to the point where they're not getting decent grades anymore?
Well, let me just say this. If your child is attending school regularly and getting good grades, there's very little chance that they need residential treatment, which is what I'm talking about here. But if they're attending school regularly and getting good grades, they might.
I'm thinking more, not attending school, but school accepts late work, can do some stuff from home, send it in.
That's a good question, and the answer to that is usually the child needs special education. If they can't get out the door, I have a lot of school districts that are sending teachers to kids' houses. They're getting good grades, and let me say, so I'm going to go back to that political thing, right? Where 18, either graduation or 22. So let's graduate these kids, right? Let's do whatever we can. Let's get teachers into their houses for these kids who can't leave their houses, and give them an ability to get credits. Some families are okay with that. They just want their kids to graduate. For me, I always say, get all of those services that you can before it's too late. And if a child can't make it to school, and because of anxiety, because of depression, because of OCD, they should be getting special education services.
I would argue, a child could try to commit suicide even though they're attending school and doing well in school.
Absolutely.
Right, so that would be, if they attempt suicide, that's eligible for residential.
You
No,
guys-
not necessarily.
You guys, we were doing good. They never get through a topic.
Okay.
Can we go back to that because we really have to rush because we want to get to the next
Yeah. So the answer to that really quick is no, not necessarily.
Okay.
And it gets hard. If your kid is able to attend school regularly, they tried to commit suicide once, we go back to the chronic issue, right? And what, it really depends case by case. Another defense that I see all the time is home problem. You are bad parents. Your child, this is not our problem, this is your problem. When your kid comes to school, they're fine. They're engaged, they're social, they're happy, they're popular. You have a problem with your kids, clearly that's a home problem. I call that the home problem defense. It's a pocket problem. This has nothing to do with us, this has to do with you. Again, I always go back to great. If they're doing great when they come to school, that's wonderful, but can they get to school? They have a good defense if your kid is coming to school and doing great, but they have a bad defense if your kid does great when they're there, but they can't quite get there. Parent-child relationship problem, again, this just goes to the blame the parents, blame the parents. Anybody who has had me as their attorney knows that I actually lose my mind in IEP meetings when teams start to blame parents. It's a game that every single school district knows that I don't play, the blame parent game, because, you know, most of you are going through hell and in crisis and have blamed yourselves enough for everything that's happening. And these problems, if we're in an IEP meeting, are due to a disability. But that is something that school districts play on. The emotions of very emotional parents. You know, this is your fault. This is a home problem. If you were doing your job at home, your kids would be doing fine in school. So you know, sometimes in my cases, I spend, you know, months and months getting parents out of that train of thought, you know, of, well, we should have done this, we should have done that. You're parents, you're not professionals. And if your child has a severe disability, then it's on the school district, it's not on you to provide those services. Again, the diagnosis versus eligibility, that comes back as a defense. Great, your child has been diagnosed with anxiety. We don't think that anxiety affects their ability to learn. So that goes back to that talk of, you know, just because your child has been diagnosed with something does not mean that they are special education eligible or RTC eligible. So I'm still talking about the IEP process here. So assuming that they find your kid eligible, we've gone through the assessment process now. You've handed them over all of these documents. You're sitting in an IEP meeting and they go through eligibility, they go through all the assessment, and they say, yes, we think your kid has a disability. They qualify under the disability classification of either OHI or ED or both or autism or whatever. Again, I always say it doesn't matter. But they find them eligible. So this is something that I always tell parents. An IEP is a document that develops goals, yearly goals that your child should be able to meet. Needs drive goals. So what are your child's needs? Does your child have an inability to cope? Is your child anxious, depressed, have attention problems? Needs drive goals. Goals drive services. So services, the services page is that big one. What does your child need to meet those goals? So I'm just going to say this as an overview. Needs drive goals, goals drive services, services drive placement. And it's kind of always the elephant in the room when we're talking RTC because placement comes at the very end, right? So you're sitting through these 3-hour-long meetings, waiting. All you want to know is where they're going to offer to place my kid. None of it else matters. But the truth of the matter is it does. They have to go through this process. So services are all of those things like, for example, so this kid has, 30 emotional goals. What is necessary to meet those emotional goals? How many hours a week of counseling? What kind of placement? Is it inclusive? Is it exclusive? Is it, a placement with 5 kids? Is it a placement with 20 kids? Or where the services can be implemented, I should say. What are the services that are necessary? And then once they figure out the services, then they go to placement. So where can they provide these services? So 24-hour supervision and comprehensive therapeutic treatment cannot be provided in a general education setting, right? Usually that can all 24/7 can only be provided in residential treatment. So if it's determined that a kid needs, full-time therapeutic intensive remediation in order to be able to learn, then the only placements we could be looking at is residential. Which is what this is another big thing that I want to spend 5 minutes on, is least restrictive environment. So a lot of parents come to me whose kids may or may not be in crisis or whose kids were in crisis and don't have an IEP and they unilaterally placed them. And there's a law which is actually used to be in the parent's benefit. In the case of residential treatment, it's usually not. But it says that all children with disabilities must have the opportunity to be educated with non-disabled peers to the greatest extent appropriate or possible. So this means that, I'm going to go through this. There's a continuum, and this is, theoretically, if your kid didn't go from 0 to 10 overnight, this is what should have happened. If your kid has had a long-standing mental health issues, the continuum. So first of all, they get an IEP. They're not in crisis. The first kind of step is resource push-in. So if we're talking about mental health issues, this is somebody that's coming into the classroom in a general education setting and helping your kid, whether that be emotional support, A lot of kids have anxiety related to learning disabilities, right? So maybe it's support around their learning that's going to help their anxiety. If that doesn't work, then we start looking at pulling kids out of the classroom, right, into kind of segregated areas for an hour a day, 2 hours a day. So that might be pull-out counseling. You know, that's a service in their IEP we're looking at now. Instead of somebody coming into the classroom and keeping them around their non-disabled peers, we're talking about them taking an hour a day, an hour a week to go meet with a counselor outside of the classroom, and that's considered being pulled out of the general education setting. If that doesn't work, then we look at a special day class. Special day classes are segregated classrooms within a public school setting. For example, I'm going to talk about one in Berkeley because that's where I live, and I see that one a lot. It's called a Counseling Enriched class. It's ran by the Seneca folks, if any of you are familiar with Seneca. And theoretically, not theoretically, it does have counselors, social workers, therapists within the segregated setting in the high school, and it's this, kind of little cocoon. The problem with special day classes that I run into is that kids with both behavioral issues, externalizers, and internalizers end up in these classes together, and they can trigger each other. You know, some kids with severe anxiety cannot be around a kid that's going to throw a desk across the room. And it's not always, I will say that some school districts and some classrooms are very considerate of that, where they might have externalizers in, a different area, and they're very considerate of that. But that's what general education is, right? It's a big, diverse population of kids. They can't make it perfect. So it might not be ideal for your kid. But legally, it might suffice. It's hard to say to a judge, this classroom is horrible because there's a kid that throws the chair across the room. As an attorney, I can't prove that because we have privacy rules. I can't pull that kid's records and say, this kid has oppositional defiant disorder, which is, damaging to my kid with anxiety. So it becomes a problem legally when they're making these offers that look good on paper that aren't necessarily good in practice. Moving on, if a special day class doesn't work, then we start to look at non-public schools. So non-public schools are more restrictive because non-public schools are only schools for kids with disabilities. So we're looking at, schools for kids with high-functioning autism that have severe anxiety. We're looking at schools for kids with depression. We're looking at, much has been kicked out 4 times for running away and, trying to hurt himself or other people. Those are kind of slam dunk out-of-state residential cases, but they're few and far between, right? So signing the IEP, I want to address this really quick too. There's a difference between consent and agreement. So IEP teams say to a lot of my families, a lot of my clients, and they're notorious for this, if you don't agree to the IEP, we can't give you anything, right? So maybe they're offering, 3 times a week of counseling from a really great place and occupational therapy and behavioral support services in the home, but you don't agree that that you don't agree that that's appropriate, but it's something or nothing, right? So they'll say to you, well, if you don't agree with this, we can't give you anything. We know you don't agree that your kid needs to be in residential, but if you don't agree to this, you can't. That's not true. In California, districts have to have consent. Consent is different than an agreement. I can't tell you how many times that I copy and paste the definition of consent and agreement and send it to special ed directors because it makes me so mad that they tell parents, you have to agree to this. You don't, you just have to consent. So I always say, you can consent to whatever you want without agreement. So in your case, if they're going to offer you something, and you can't afford residential, but you want to fight that, you want to take what they're giving you, until you have the opportunity to fight what they've offered, what you say is, I consent to the implementation of X, 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 and X, but I don't agree that it constitutes a FAPE. So you don't have to agree with them that what they're doing is appropriate, but you can consent to the services while you fight them. So it can be partial, it can be, full, but the pages are confusing because it has these little check boxes that say, I agree that the school district has offered a FAPE. I agree that it's a FAPE with the exception of. I always say cross all that out and write an addendum, write a sentence. I consent to this, but I don't agree that it constitutes a FAPE. Or you might agree. I agree that the goals and services are appropriate, but I don't agree that the placement that was chosen can fulfill those goals and services, or my child can reach those goals and services. So signing away, you can sign away your rights, you know. The school district will say, well, you know, they signed that's always with me. Well, they signed the parents come to me and say, we're not happy with this. Oh, but we signed because we had to, so we could at least get this counseling. You signed away your rights to fight it. Let me just say, as an attorney, I can fight that, and I do. But it makes my life harder, and it makes your life harder. So be very careful about what you're signing. So unilateral placement, we've covered this along the ways, and this is a lot of what comes to me from Willows. You know, parents that have made that decision, this is what my kid needs, or came to the conclusion because they were in a state of total crisis and they could not wait for the school district. The school district had failed them in X, Y, or Z way, either going through that IEP process, which is the case sometimes, and having, you know, I have kids that are hospitalized for a long period of time, and parents are going through this IEP process expecting their kids to get out of a hospital and into an appropriate placement, and at the end of it, they're like, oh, well, we think your kid would be fine, you know, in one of these special day classes. And it might not be the case, and we have, you know, 10,000 people that have said, no, this kid needs residential treatment. So you have the option to unilaterally place your kid. I should say option if you have the ability, right? A lot of families don't. It's very, very expensive, but some people do. And sometimes parents come to me and I look over the case and I say, if you unilaterally place your kid, I can get you your money back, you know, depending on the level of violations. And so if you're considering unilaterally placing your kid, I always say talk to an attorney. An attorney might tell you, I will say too, parents have said to me, you know, I'm going to unilaterally place my kid, can you look over my case? And I say to them, you don't have a good unilateral placement case. Don't do it, unless you are prepared to pay for the entire thing yourself. Unilaterally placing in wilderness, that's a big one, right? Wilderness is always a big one. Judges have found over and over again that wilderness is not educationally based. They don't have school in wilderness. So the only time that I'm getting wilderness paid for usually is as compensation for some trauma that has been caused by the school. For example, the case that I said at the beginning, where this kid was hiding under a desk for 50% of his time thinking that an airplane was flying into the school and tried to commit suicide multiple times on school grounds. Those are big violations. I got wilderness paid for in that case. But in most situations, wilderness isn't educational. They don't have a school, and so judges have said, sorry, you know, I'm excited to hear about whether or not we can start holding insurance companies more accountable for this, because it's oftentimes, you know, necessary. Wilderness, my understanding, is necessary in a lot of cases before residential. I just want to say that. If you unilaterally place in wilderness, it's hard to get reimbursement for that from the school district. Almost never do I do it. So now we're talking about residential placement. The requirements. They're pretty simple and straightforward, but without one of these elements here, you can't get reimbursement. The first one being 10-day notice. The congressional intent behind 10-day notice, and this simply means, dear school district, I am writing to provide you with 10 business days notice that due to your failure to serve my child, I'm unilaterally placing them in a residential treatment facility. Give 10-day notice. If you give it to them, you know, 30 days or 60 days after because you just found out, does that mean you can't get reimbursement at all? No, but it means that you can't get reimbursement until 10 days after you give them that letter. So your child might have been placed for 60 days, that's on you now. After that 10-day notice, following the 10-day notice, you could still go after them. So it just, it's important to do it right off the bat. And I always say, do it no matter what. Some parents say to me, well, we don't know if we're going to go after them. We don't know if, you know, at the end of the day, the school district is going to be responsible. I always say, give them that notice. It doesn't hurt you in any way. It preserves your right to go seek reimbursement later. Always give the notice. Patty, always tell parents to give notice no matter what.
To change your mind.
Exactly, always. Other thing about notice is you can give notice in the IEP meeting. I like written notice because I'm an attorney and we like everything in writing because it's easier to prove. But if you're at an IEP meeting and they say to you, you know, we don't agree that your child needs residential, we are offering a placement in our special day class, you right there and then at the IEP meeting can say we are not accepting your offer and hereby notifying you that we will be unilaterally placing our kid. So that takes the place of the 10-day notice, 10 days in writing or at the last IEP meeting. If you're going to do it at the IEP meeting, which can be awkward, a lot of times I say to families, walk out of the IEP meeting and sign the letter, so you don't have to, it can be awkward. But that can take the place. Again, proof of service, if you're doing the writing, try to get it stamped, faxed, certified mail, have to have that proof. I do have school districts say, parents come to me and say, I gave it to them in writing. I went and handed it to them, and the school district say, no, we didn't, and I have no way to prove it. So it's important. Non-public versus private school. This is also a very important thing because a lot of families say to me, I am going to unilaterally place and I am going to place at, a residential treatment center or a boarding school, a therapeutic boarding school. I'm going to go with that because therapeutic boarding schools, I don't think any right now, therapeutic boarding schools that are certified by the state of California. There is a big difference. So private schools, there's one in Montana. The list changes all the time, and that's another political thing. But non-public schools are schools that are certified by the state of California. It's important because school districts cannot contract with an educational placement unless they're certified by the state of California. Also, judges cannot order school districts to contract. So even if you were right in your assertion that your kid needs this particular placement for this particular reason, and we went all the way through trial and the judge said, yep, you were right, a judge can only order reimbursement. School districts can only provide reimbursement for parents for private schools. Private schools and non-public schools are different. Non-public schools are for children with disabilities, theoretically. Private schools are just private. They're not nonprofit, they're for-profit usually. They might not have special ed teachers there, they might not have all of these things, these components that the state of California says are necessary for children with disabilities. That goes with private schools and non-public schools in state too that aren't residentials. You're looking at me really confused.
No, just,
okay. So, yeah.
So I'm curious how you think this would work in the law, because the state of California has recently, or at least in my experience, they will not certify as a non-public school until there's a placement made. So how does that work for the reimbursement? Because you may have a parent that says, I can't wait for California to certify, and there's nobody currently there from California, so I'm going to go there. And how do you think that would work for reimbursement?
So let me just say, when we're talking about reimbursement, let's pretend all is well in the world and we've won our case. We've convinced the school district that this is what is needed, either through litigation or otherwise. But the kid is at a non-certified school. School districts can reimburse parents no matter what,
Okay.
for anything.
Okay.
You would be surprised at the things they get parents reimbursed for.
So you
horse camp.
You can get the reimbursed and then the non-public school, and then they can do a contract after that.
Yeah, or there can be monthly reimbursement. So I have a lot of kids in private schools that have been unilaterally placed there. I will say sometimes school districts say, can parents do a reimbursement model because this private school is so much better than anything we could provide, for this particular kid. I have a lot of transgendered youth where non-public schools, not necessarily, there's none available that can take a transgendered child. So we have to look at the private sector and, hopefully the parents can front that money on a monthly basis and the school district will reimburse them. School districts can contract, which is a settlement, right? They can contract with parents for whatever they want to. They cannot contract with schools that the state has not approved.
Okay.
And I will always say to parents, when I have a legal case and they're deciding the placement, non-public schools are better for me, not necessarily for your kid. So there's sometimes a deviation between a good legal case and what is great for your kid. This school might be perfect for your kid and not certified. I will say to you, if you have an option, choose the non-public school because school districts and their attorneys know it's going to be a harder battle to get that private school covered. A judge isn't necessarily going to love it. Mostly, honestly, because a lot of the private schools don't have special education providers. Not necessarily that special education providers are wonderful, but it's hard to go to a judge and say, you know, my child has a severe learning disability and anxiety resulting from that, and, you know, they went to this therapeutic boarding school that doesn't have a special ed teacher. I know that a lot of teachers are more qualified, gen ed teachers are more qualified than special ed teachers, but it's hard to make that argument, and there's a reason, you know, the courts have kind of geared in the way of California Department of Education of what is appropriate for kids and what is not.
I'm confused. The term non-public school, are you equating it to a therapeutic boarding school, or are you equating it to a school in or out of California? I just don't understand the term.
Thank you. Yes, I can clarify that. So non-public school applies to any school that serves children with disabilities that is certified by the state of California. So there's non-public day schools within the state, within the Bay Area. Tons of non-public day schools in the Bay Area. Then there's non-public residential schools in the state. Then there's non-public out-of-state schools. And the term non-public automatically means that it's certified. Private means it's not.
And if it's certified, is it in-state?
No.
Can be certified by the state but out of state?
There's tons of, yeah, there's a whole list. And if you want the list, it's on the California Department of Education website for certified non-public schools.
It actually, they removed the list, and they made it very hard to find that out now. About
Somebody
3
should
months
put it
ago.
on the
You
website.
know, I looked up the list on Thursday and it was there, so I don't
Yeah,
know.
no, it's there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there.
Yeah, and, you know, I keep a handy copy. The list changes all the time. So parents will say to me, I want to place my kid here, and I'm like, that's not on the list. And they're like, yes, it is. And they hand me the list, and all of a sudden it is. So the list changes.
Can you repeat the website? What is it?
It's California Department of Education, CDE. And it's kind of complicated to get there to the list. You basically have to do a search for non-public schools, and then they have all this criteria. Out of state, in-state, high school, K through 8. You have to narrow it down. But then it generates a list for you of schools that the CDE has approved. Okay.
Your districts, or yeah, we're your district, so it's a special education local area plan. And if you look up on your district, you can see where your district has
Contracted
students
with.
contracted.
Yeah, I don't recommend that though, just because it's so limiting. And I will also say that there's reasons why school districts, again, this goes to the political nature of it all, right? There's reasons that school district contracts with certain RTCs, not necessarily because they're the best, but maybe because they're giving them a deal. Right. I'll contract with you and send 10 kids to you if you give me a really good deal. So I have a situation like that right now. I have no idea why the school district agreed to pick this one RTC, but it's not appropriate for this kid. It's really hard for me to fight legally, but for some reason, they want their kid in the school district wants them in this particular placement. Most likely it has to do with some deal they've cut with them. Although it would be really hard for me to prove that, but you know, I urge you to look at the entire list and don't let them say we don't have a contract with that particular school. I also want to say stay put really quick, just because I addressed it here. IEP placement, why it is ideal, is because you have this thing called stay put, another legal term of art. So, stay put, and this is one of the reasons why school districts might deny you an IEP placement, because they could get stuck paying for residential treatment for as long as you want because of this thing called stay put. If they admit that your kid needs residential treatment, they give you an IEP as such. A year from now, they sit down at an IEP meeting and they say, you know, your kid's made all this progress, we want to pull them out of residential, which is the goal, right? LRE is the goal, they have every right to do that. And you say, we don't agree with you, we're implementing stay put. Which means that the kid gets to stay there through the pendency of any litigation that might happen. Litigation can take a year and a half, 2 years. So all of a sudden, they're paying for a placement, you know, they're stuck in this placement that they don't agree with, and it can go on for years. Hold on 1 second. So I do want to say that sometimes school districts, even in the most extreme cases that I'm involved in, will go into an IEP meeting and say, we don't think the kid needs residential treatment, even though they know I would win this case in front of a judge. It's because they want to get the parents into a settlement agreement that has a set period of time. We will fund the kid for a year, 2 years, a year and a half. That is a set period of time. And it's really hard for parents to deny that, right? Because you're staring down the barrel of $200,000 versus the possibility of losing a case. You know, I can never guarantee that we're going to win, even if I feel really confident in front of a judge. Very few parents do. We as attorneys, as parent attorneys, count on the Ninth Circuit and our federal courts to kind of back us up more than the Office of Administration hearings does. So you might be, you know, so when a school district says, you know, we're not going to give you an IEP placement, but we'll give you a year, and that year is worth $120,000, or you can wager that money on going to trial. Most of my clients take that, and honestly, most of the time, I suggest that they do. Again, because of all of the emotional stress they're under, most of my clients are not in a position to do well in trial. That's just the nature of the position that they're in with a kid that's in crisis. So I do want to say that, you know, just because they're denying residential placement in an IEP meeting doesn't mean that they don't think your kid doesn't need it. Doesn't mean that they're not going to pay for it. It might just mean that they want to get you into a settlement agreement opposed to an IEP, because that IEP can go on and on.
We're starting the negotiation with that point.
Time check here. Oh, it looks like we need to get to questions.
Does the state put apply in reverse if the parents want to move the child but the school district likes it?
No, you can withdraw your consent for replacement whenever. But I will say that you might have to file for due process. They might say, if you don't agree, if they win and they're found to be justified, you might be giving up all of your rights to special education if you withdraw your consent. But
They
it
want to move
doesn't.
from one placement to another because it's not working.
Yeah, it's a case-by-case basis. They don't have state put. School districts don't have state put, usually.
Deborah, excuse me, I think you go through your last two slides, and then we're going to hold questions until after Nancy speaks, and we'll take.
Yeah, so reimbursement is important, and I just want to cover this. I had a spreadsheet that I wanted to give you. I don't know if we can try to see it on here, but I just want to talk about reimbursement. The most important thing, and the one thing that I will not, assuming that you have unilaterally placed your kid, okay, and I say to you, you call me and I say, guess what, you have a great case. I'm going to take this case for you and we're going to go after it. Here's what I need from you to get reimbursement for any single unilateral placement. There are things that are necessary to do this. And I want to say, first of all, reimbursement does not just include the placement. When we're talking about an IEP placement for residential treatment, that includes travel. Usually an allotted travel, quarterly is what's typical in California. So quarterly visits from the parents and 2 yearly visits from the student to come home. So we're looking at plane tickets, we're looking at hotel, we're looking at meal allotment, we're looking at rental cars, we might be looking at outside therapy services, we're looking at a 2-year statute, so we're looking for what you paid for in those 2 years. And I want to say with reimbursement, we're looking at a negotiation, right? So as an attorney, that number is, I want it to be as high as possible. So we're going to be looking at all of the money you've spent over the past 2 years. And the reason why this is important is because parents come to me with no proof of what they've paid. And there's certain proof that's required, and I'll get into that really quick. But if you are considering unilaterally placing your kid, I always suggest get a separate credit card if you can. If you're paying with it with checks or with anything like that, get that statement every single month, start redacting, because a bank statement is necessary and you don't want everybody knowing all of your business. So record keeping is very important. Both judges and school districts require 2 things, and I think I have it here, yes. Invoice and or receipt. That's one thing, so it's either an invoice or a receipt. And the second thing is the proof of payment in the form of a redacted credit card statement, redacted bank statement, or a canceled check. Let me tell you, when I go into a negotiation, I have binders this thick of reimbursement documentation. And I will not file a case until I have it, because I have made the mistake of filing for parents and getting them award of $120,000 and them not having the documentation at the end of the day. It makes me look bad, makes them look bad, makes everybody look bad, and we did a whole lot of fighting for nothing. So if you are considering this, it's a big deal, and it's way more time consuming than anybody could imagine, especially if we start getting into the insurance thing. Sometimes insurance covers the therapy and we have to start looking at the bills, what was covered by insurance, what was not covered by insurance. It can take a year to get this reimbursement documentation gathered, and I think I'm a little bit more OCD than other attorneys. Other attorneys are like, that's on you. For me, I try to help parents through this process with the reimbursement. and I have somebody on my staff that's dedicated, all she does is this reimbursement stuff. It's her specialty. So I want to say it's important. Keep track of everything that you're paying for and do it in an organized way. And those two things. And parents get mad at me, well, why would I have to give, if I have the receipt and the invoice that says paid, why do I have to have a statement? This is not me, this is the courts saying it. I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me either, but this is what is necessary. Again, with the 2-year statute of limitations, everything going back 2 years, 2-year statute of limitations is not only for reimbursement, but it's for the IDA claims in general. I cannot make claims past 2 years unless there was some blatant misrepresentation, lie, an excuse, a very good reason to go past that statute. Past reimbursement versus prospective funding, right? So those are two separate things. Parents might have unilaterally placed before they got an attorney, for example, or when they had an attorney, and we're looking at what was in the past that we want to reimburse, and then we're looking at something separate of what it's going to cost in the future for either placement or services. So both of those things become a negotiation point. And when we're looking at prospective funding, parents have to get, really detailed statements as to what X, and X could cost in the future, and start thinking about. And we can get past reimbursement and possible prospective funding through an IEP. So, there's a lot of ways that we negotiate, that I, as an attorney, negotiate with school districts on how to work these things out. And it gets complicated, and I think the number one point of these slides is to, be on your game in terms of what you're spending, when you're spending, be on your game in terms of getting documentation for what is recommended for your kid in the past and in the future. Keeping emails, keeping, all documents. And I think, they're gonna email you out a sample spreadsheet. For some reason, we didn't get it in here, but that just shows, kind of the cover of my reimbursement documentation that shows, placement, reimbursement for the placement itself. It might be non-public school first, a day school. You might have, funding from Orion Academy, for example, for 6 months, and then all of a sudden funding's for residential treatment because they got kicked out of Orion. You might have had to use a transport service because the child is violent or out of control, and so you had to hire a transport service to get them there. It wasn't safe for some reason. All of that stuff becomes part of the reimbursement and negotiations if your child was entitled to that in the first place and the school district didn't do it. Okay. Questions?
Yes or no question? A very quick question. Charter schools. My daughter's in a charter school. Does she fall under OUSD or?
It depends on who the charter school uses for their special education. Some of them use a charter SELPA.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, then they are the ones that are responsible.
Hi, so I'm finding out that I unilaterally placed my kid last year. The school district didn't have anything. I requested IEP July last year, never heard anything from them, all that stuff. What happens, so now I am in the process of getting an IEP, and they went out and assessed in Utah last week, and going on. What happens now, you get the IEP assessment, I might get a settlement from them or something. What happens if I have to move out of my school district?
It depends on the settlement. So a settlement agreement often contains a term that any prospective funding gets cut off if you leave the jurisdiction. If we're talking about past reimbursement, it's usually not an issue, and you probably wouldn't want to, here's that spreadsheet.
I can't do it full screen, but
yeah,
this is sort of,
yeah,
this is what you'll be sent.
Yeah, this is just an example of, what we do for the reimbursement documentation. But so to answer your question, it depends on the settlement agreement, and that would be a term that you want to put in there. Any prospective funding is usually hard to get because you become the responsibility of somebody else. But the past, reimbursement, if there's good violations, bad violations there, then, yeah, it just depends.
When a child comes home from RTC, if they had therapy as part of the IEP, and when they come home, is the school district still responsible for providing that mental health?
Absolutely. So transition is part of, if your child has an IEP, transition is part of it. Even if they didn't agree with you that residential treatment was appropriate, if your kid is coming out of residential treatment, theoretically there's going to be transition services that are necessary. And again, you know, the things that are available in the Bay Area as non-public services that school district can contract for are kind of limited. And so a lot of parents want to use services like Coyote Coast, which you've probably all heard of, where, you know, there's a lot of different services that are not certified. So again, that becomes an issue of reimbursement. A school district might be willing to, you know what, we agree Coyote Coast does really good transitional services, so we'll pay for this on the side, we'll pay you if you pay them.
I was wondering about if a student.
I'm sorry, just really quick, yeah, I was pointing at this, yeah.
Thank you. I just have a question. The 10-day notice.
Last question, and we'll hold
Okay.
all the questions until 1 o'clock. Sorry, that would be great, and then we can start.
It's 10-day notice. Do you send that if you did not have an IEP in place, or is that only for people who already had one?
Send it without an IEP, please, or with IEP, please.
Okay, thank you.